Hi everybody. I think we'll get started in just a minute. And we'll see if the people out front want to come in and join us. Well, I think we can go ahead. Maybe some people struggling on the side there. But we're really happy that you were able to come today because we only had the one announcement in the Rossmoor News, which was today. And then, just out of curiosity, how many people saw the announcement in the Rossmoor News? Wow. Okay, so that really underscores how important that is. And how many people are here because they saw the flyer in Peacock Theater? Oh. Peacock Theater or other venues. Okay, thanks. That's actually very helpful. So my name is Rick Sterling, and I'm with the Rossmoor Friends of the Mountain Diablo Peace and Justice Center. And we just filed our papers with the administration a few days ago, and the number of members who signed up is actually lower this year, which we're kind of surprised because there's almost 170 on the email list. So if you're, we'd welcome you to join the club, pay $10. I think it's a sliding scale of 10 or 15 or $20 for the year, but we'd be happy to have you join. We're happy to have you just on the email list so we can let you know about our events, but if you support the activities of the center, we'll be happy to have you join the club. We're very glad today to have Professor Jack Rasmus. He spoke here a couple of years ago, and a very good response. And we were thinking about, at the recent meeting of the board of the center, the board of the club rather, we were talking about all of the events that are going on domestically, and internationally, what Trump is doing, and so forth. And we think that Jack is the perfect person to talk about that. He's the author of numerous books. I think, is it 4 or 5, Jack? It's 7, or is that 8? He's the author of 8 books, and many of them are published by the outstanding Clarity Publishing House. I know they publish really high quality books, and I think he's going to tell you a little bit about his forthcoming book, which is The Twilight of American Imperialism. But we're happy to have him with us here today. He taught for many years at St. Mary's College. He was an economics professor there. And he's got a podcast, he's got a website, he's a frequent guest on various programs, as well as an insightful analyst. So please welcome Jack Rasmus.
Rick said, is called The Twilight of American Imperialism. Really appropriate now in the age of the second tour of Trump, right? And after I give a presentation, I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions because it ties right into the Trump events of today. In fact, the key chapter factor is about what's been going on since 2025 and 26 and where that's going. But there is a continuous sort of relationship between what Trump is doing. This isn't new. This isn't a break. This is a continuation of trends that have been occurring here for some time. And they're just accelerating now. Okay? So let's just jump into it. You know, I mean, if it's I forget who said this. I think it was the Supreme Court judge. I forget his name, but he said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Right? You probably heard that phrase. And the same thing goes for empire. Right? There's a lot of definitions of what an empire is. I think people are beginning to realize America has an empire for some time. But the question of the day is it in decline? A lot of commentators on the left or independent are now saying the American empire is in decline. Actually, some say it's collapsing. Well, I'm not of the school that says it's collapsing. But I do believe that there are all kinds of indicators that the empire is in a stage of decline. Not an imminent collapse, as some would say. But most of those who say collapse do it with an impressionistic, anecdotal kind of analysis. You know, I mean, here are the bricks, right? And the bricks are on the rise and so forth, and the dollar is shaky, and et cetera. But what I'm trying to do in this book is to give a material analysis, a deep material analysis, showing indicators, quantitative and otherwise, why it is in decline. In other words, to really measure that decline in a number of ways. And the three key variables that I use to make the argument that it is in decline is to look at the costs of empire and show how those costs have been accelerating and almost out of control. And the financing of the empire, where empires are expensive. It takes a lot of money, not just for military, but for democracies and all the rest, right? How is the funding of the empire being conducted? And are those funds not keeping up with the costs? So it's the gap between the costs of empire, which are accelerating, and I do quantify that, and I'll share some of that quantification with you. And the funding of the empire, how we've been paying for it, and while that funding is getting more difficult. So the affordability of the empire that you can quantitatively, materially show is one indicator of decline. Other indicators of decline are when you look at the practices of empire and identify what do empires do, what are the practices that they engage in. You know, obviously wars, right? Invasions, direct wars, limited military activities, proxy wars, right? And regime change activities, military alliances, and so on and so forth, right? Those are the practices, how empires expand, how they maintain themselves, how they defend themselves. There's a list of practices. And there are also, thirdly, institutions associated with those practices. What are the institutions of empire? And are those institutions performing the way they used to? Are they as efficient? Are they as effective? Or are they weakening? Are those institutions weakening? And of course, the institutions are the structures that implement the practices of empire, but they take money. So you tie all these three quantifiable evidences of empire, and that's what I try to do in the book, to make the argument that, well, look, it is in decline. It's not collapsing, folks. Don't overestimate your opponents, right? And that's a big error that's made. Sometimes, among progressives on the left, there's a lot of wishful thinking. Oh, there's evidence it's in trouble. Oh, it's collapsing. No. I'm not going to mention the writers, because I do respect them, who make the argument a collapse. But I'm not among them. I'm a little bit more circumspect about that question. Show me the evidence, you know. I spent a lot of years in the labor movement, in the union movement in my youth, as an organizer, as a local president. I ran strikes and everything else for well over a decade. And one thing I learned was to never underestimate your opponent, and never think he's only got one card to play, because he's got a couple more in his pocket, and you better be ready to play his cards. So I guess I'm a little conservative in that sense, a little more cautious about making extreme arguments that your opponent is very weak and he's collapsing. No, he's not. Okay, having said that, let's look at the costs of empire. And the book really begins with the early 1990s. It's not a whole history of the American empire, although I will say that the American empire, or America, has empire in its DNA from the very beginning, from the very origins of the country. It was about extending an empire across the Appalachians into the whole continent. It was imperial. In fact, that's one of the reasons we broke with Britain, England, way back in the 1770s, is because the English Empire didn't want expansion to the west. They wanted to keep the west pretty much away from the colonies because they were trading with the Native Americans, and they didn't want to upset that trade. And the Americans just wanted the land. So they sort of, the proclamation of 1763 kept the colonists, on the other side of the Appalachians. And that was a source, that was one of the sources of aggravation between the colonists and the home country at that time, England. But with the Revolutionary War, that opened up the West, and empires are about land grabbing. That's a critical element. Grab the land. Land may mean actual occupy the area, but it's mostly about resources. Grab the resources. That's what it's really about. Just to complete the little history, the U.S. Pretty much took over the continent, and it drove out the English, it drove out the French, drove out the Spanish, right? Drove out the Mexicans, right? Took over the land. Pretty much, and once it had acquired the continent, well, then it set its sights across the Pacific, right? Hawaii and all the Pacific islands, of which mostly are American protectorates to this day, the Caribbean and other places. So, America has always had the empire in its DNA, pretty much. You get, then in the 20th century, the American empire turns east, looks east, and participates in World War I and World War II. Very cleverly, by the way, let the Europeans beat each other up, and then it jumped in at the end and grabbed all the goodies, especially after World War II. Very clever, very clever. And the U.S. pretty much inherited the empire, much of it of the British and the French and others. So, the story, though, is not that story. I mean, that's just a historical analysis. I was more interested in what's going on in this latest phase of the empire, which really takes a leap after World War II, but then takes another leap in the 1980s. This is a period, the 1980s, when, of course, the U.S. Pretty much tamed the Japanese. Remember, Japan Inc. was a threat. Remember that in the 70s, 80s? Well, they tamed them in the 1980s, brought them to heel. They tamed the Europeans. This occurred in negotiations of the Plaza Accords in New York with Japan and the Louvre Agreement with Europe. So any threats from the capitalist allies were contained. They were absorbed pretty well. And then, of course, the Soviet Union collapses. That was a biggie, right? And that's where my story picks up, with the agreements. As the Soviet Union imploded, the U.S., of course, had agreements with Gorbachev and others not to move NATO east, right? And even when the Soviets agreed to the reunification of Germany, the agreement was East Germany would not have NATO and American troops on its grounds. Well, we quickly, ignored that. And then, of course, in the late 1990s, the decision was made about 1994 by Clinton, was to move NATO east, right? And that moving of NATO east began in 1999 when several Eastern European countries were absorbed, and then it went even further in 2002 when the Baltics and the other countries were absorbed into NATO. And then the plan was immediately, when Bush came to power, to go even further. George W. Bush, 2001. And it was as early as, 2002, 3 that they set their sights on, guess what? The Caucasus and Ukraine. And by 2008, they tried to instigate a regime change and invasion of southern Russia there in Georgia, right? Which didn't work out too well because they couldn't really support Georgia militarily. And then, the focus was on Ukraine. They tried in 2005, I think it was, electorally. The U.S. empire attempts to gain, an objective, if it can, without using military means first. It's much more efficient, less costly to do it through some sort of electoral regime change operation. The U.S. is very good at regime changes, although it's not always successful. So they tried in 2005, there was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, but it ended up with a split government. Half of the populace, the vote, and the political parties and forces were split right down the middle. Half of them were pro-Russia, half of them were pro-Europe. And they really didn't get full control in 2005. And they had to wait until 2014 to really pull off a coup. That was the classic CIA coup. And I won't go into the details of that, some of you probably know that. That was how they grabbed Ukraine. And immediately the idea was to bring Ukraine into NATO, move NATO east, move it east. The Russians responded and took Crimea, and everything kind of settled down for a while because Ukraine, the new Western CIA-controlled Ukraine government, wasn't really ready to take on the Russians yet. And there were other issues of empire during that decade, the Obama decade. There was the Libya regime change operation in 2011. Then they went after Syria. Remember, Bush was talking about the axis of evil, right? And he identified the countries that he was going to go after, and they went after them one by one. They didn't succeed necessarily right away in Syria for reasons I described. It was a very much complicated situation. It wasn't as easy as Libya. And they were continually trying electoral CIA regime change operations in Venezuela. They almost pulled it off in 2002. Then they tried again in 2014. And then Trump in 2019 really upped the ante, and he really tried to instigate a coup in Venezuela. But it didn't work out because these regime change operations were not really supplemented by U.S. military action. See, when the U.S. engages in limited and other forms of special ops and military actions, along with CIA internal disruptions, regime change tends to be more successful. And of course, we saw that in Venezuela now. We saw that in 24 in Syria. So the empire is going on the offensive in the sense that it's no longer reluctant to use indirect or direct military means to supplement internal CIA regime change operations. And when it does that, when it pulls out all the plugs, it tends to be more more successful, which we've seen lately. The other lesson since the last quarter century is that direct military intervention is too expensive. It costs too much, especially if you can't put together a coalition to share the cost and the burden, the military burden. The last direct military action by the U.S. was Iraq and Afghanistan. And we saw how limited in success that was, right? It cost a lot of money. Estimates by the Brown University study of the cost of military involvement by the U.S. is that those two operations since 2001, Iraq, which ended up in a kind of a compromise with the Shia groups and the Sunni groups, and Afghanistan, the 20-year war in Afghanistan, which the U.S. just pulled out of for a minute, cost $9 trillion. $9 trillion for those two wars only. I'm not counting all the other regime change operations that occurred, ever since the military operations. So what we've got was a realization by the Obama period, and certainly still, although with Trump we don't know, that direct military is too costly. It's too costly. Plus, it's difficult to pull off with a professional army unless you're going after a weak, relatively weak military state, a small country, right? Military or whatever, right? It just costs too much. The empire is shifting in its practices and its strategy from direct military to limited military action, no-fly zones, bombings, naval blockades, ship seizures, special ops, and all those kind of activities, combined with CIA disruption internally, in financing groups, opposition groups, and picking opposition leaders, and decapitating some leaders and snatching others out of their beds we saw recently, right? This is a new regime change formula. More resort to limited military actions, like I said, and combined with really aggressive internal CIA activity. Now, the point is, this direct military invasions that were 25 years ago, as I said, are too expensive. And I mentioned the $9 trillion. Well, let's look at how much defense has risen since 2001. And then look at how have they paid for that cost. You hear a lot of talk, or maybe you read in the New York Times or something, the Pentagon costs $900 billion a year. I think Trump says he's going to raise it another $400 billion. Now that's only the Pentagon. That's not defense. If you look at the Defense Department numbers, Pentagon's the biggest part of the Defense Department, but it's not all the expenditures of defense, you see. The Defense Department numbers are several hundred billions more. And that's not the total that the U.S. spends on defense, because there are a whole host of other departments and activities that logically constitute defense spending. And that's one thing I do in the book. I really document this bigger picture of defense spending, because it's defense spending that maintains the empire. You see, it's not just the military Pentagon spending, it's defense. Here are some figures about it, and you get a sense about how the empire is becoming too costly. All right, let's look at some of this. Pentagon. Let's look at 2001 to 2025. How much did we spend in the Defense Department in 2001? $396 billion. How much did we spend last year on defense? $1.2 trillion. That's the Defense Department. It's not the whole picture of it, it's just the Defense Department. So we've gone from about $400 billion to $1.2 trillion in a quarter century. Now that's not everything. Let's look at some of the other departments and how much they have increased. How about veterans? Veterans Affairs. Right? Now veterans veterans are part of defense. I mean, that's, maintaining benefits for people who were in the military. It's an important part of defense. How much did we spend back in 2001 on Veterans Affairs? $45 billion. How much did we spend last year? $367 billion. This year, fiscal year, will be $440 billion. You see, a professional army is very expensive. But we've all shifted. All the major countries have shifted to professional armies in the last several decades, right? Because a drafted army is unreliable. Right? And also, modern warfare is very technological. You can't draft some 19-year-old kid for 2 years and expect him to be able to run some of the sophisticated weaponry that exists today, missiles and anti-missiles and all that stuff. You need time to train people in an army. And if you're going to have a hired professional army, which all the countries have, Russia has it and China has it, they all have professional armies now. If you're going to have a professional army, you need to have them at least 4 years and entice them for another 4 to train them. If you look at in the last 20 years alone, the cost, when Obama came into office, the cost fully loaded for one person in the military, fully loaded, all the weaponry and all the costs, maintenance bases, all the rest of it, was about $500,000 per person per year. You know what it was last year? $800,000 per person per year. Yeah, we have about 1.2 million people in the U.S. military. So there's a contradiction here in that they have to have, because of technology and so forth, they have to have a professional army, but professional armies are expensive. Another reason why the empire is becoming very difficult to finance. It's becoming very costly. Okay, so, I talked about Veterans Affairs. How about CIA and intelligence agencies? Well, back in 2001, they cost about $60 billion. What did they cost 2025? $101 billion. Now, we don't know if that's exactly the cost, because the CIA never says how much it spends. This is for a quote. On the budget, U.S. budget, it appears as all intelligence activities. So we don't know, that could be State Department intelligence, it could be, the military services, intelligence arms. There's dozens of intelligence agencies, the NSA, DARPA, and all the rest. Okay, so, and there's some talk about, some evidence that it looks like the CIA puts money into a lot of these buckets. In addition to the money it gets, there's a lot of evidence that there's a relationship between the Air Force. The Air Force has given CIA money that they quietly then shuffle back to the CIA during the budget year. But okay, so, almost double the cost of CIA or intelligence agencies. How about Homeland Security? Well, that's defense, right? Homeland Security. Well, Homeland Security was not created until, I think, 2005 or something. But there was equivalence of it in different departments. And in 2001, we spent $17 billion a year on Homeland Security. How much did we spend in 2025? $112 billion. And that's going up another $75 billion Homeland Security, right? Who's paying for those thousands of ICE agents, not to mention all the other costs? Okay, foreign aid. Foreign aid, U.S. aid, National Endowment for Democracy, military aid, military alliance aid. Well, back in 2001, it was $16 billion. And in 2020, it went up to $53 billion, but now it's back down to 20. Why is that? Well, Trump has pulled the plug on USA and NED and others as part of his attempt to cut some cost of empire. And that's what pulling out of NATO and making Europe pay 5% is all about. They're trying to find ways to reduce these rising costs wherever they can. The empire is in the process of restructuring, and that means financial restructuring as well. And that's how you have to understand part of what Trump is doing. This is a period of restructuring of the empire we're going through. I'll talk about that more shortly. Okay, so foreign aid in 2001 was 16 billion, and now it's cut, it was like 60 billion, now it's cut back to 20 billion, as he cut out all the NGOs, right? The funding of all these NGOs, who play a big role when they need to, instigate protests and demonstrations and so forth within the country. The NGOs play a big role in that. That's an area that Trump, thinks is not cost effective very much, because he's going to rely more on force. Right? He doesn't need to rely that much on funding NGOs, he thinks. Okay. What about NATO and alliance expenditures? Well, in 2001 that was 20 billion, now it's 35 billion. Cutting some NATO, financially, he's going to do more of that. How about military bases? We've got 800 military bases around the world. I mean, we're not an empire. Of course we're an empire. Right? There's over 100 bases in Germany alone. Yes. There's almost 100. A lot of them are small bases. They're all over the place. In Japan, in Europe, throughout Europe, a whole chain that goes from the UK to Germany to Italy to Greece. There's a whole chain of bases right there. Not France. France doesn't like U.S. bases. Right? When the U.S. wins a war or conquers, it never leaves. It leaves big bases in place. It never really leaves. Where it has no bases, it lost that war. I mean, we've got bases in Iraq. We've got bases in Syria. We have bases, all over the place. Of course, in Japan, Okinawa, and all these Pacific islands. South Korea has like 30,000 U.S. troops. Japan has like 50, 60,000. Europe has over 100,000. And these are expensive. At 800,000 a crack, these are expensive. And it's a source of cutting. All right. What about nuclear weapons development? That's not in the Pentagon. That's that's in the Energy Department, in the NNSA division of the Energy Department, where we just develop R&D and development of new nuclear weapons. How much did we spend on that in 2001? $6 billion. How much did we spend in 25? $25 billion. Price is going way up. All right. Then there is what's called the black budget. That doesn't exist. It doesn't show up in the government's annual budget proposals. It doesn't show up anywhere. There's only a few people, high up in the administration, in the Pentagon, key people at the head of the military committees in the Senate and House that know how much we're spending on black budget. These are the new advanced weapon systems that we don't even know about. That's a big secret. About 10 years ago, we were spending $75 billion on the black budget. I don't know what we're spending today, but it's probably at least that. Now, you've got to add into this list of charges, costs, you've got to add into this the interest on the national debt that's due to the contribution of defense spending to the annual budget deficits. We have been running budget deficits every year for the last 5 years of $1.5 to $2 trillion every year. That's probably because we've been cutting taxes on corporations and investors and the rich at the same time. How much have we cut taxes on the rich and corporations and investors? Since 2001, $17 trillion. $17 trillion in tax cutting. 8%, which goes to investors, corporations. And Trump cut $4.5 trillion in 2018, and he cut another $5 trillion this time around. Right? Well, when you cut your revenues, right, you're going to exacerbate your deficit. All things equal. Right? While you're spending double, triple for other forms of defense. So you're going to run this big budget deficit. Now, the budget deficit is also caused not just by military spending or tax cutting, it's also caused by the bailouts. 2008-9, remember that bailout? That cost almost $1 trillion. Fiscal bailout. The Federal Reserve bailed out the banks for another $4 trillion, it, but that's not in the budget, that's separate. The Federal Reserve debt is separate. Right? We're just talking about the budget and the national debt and the national budget deficit. So, you got the bailout in 2008-9. How much did they spend, did Congress spend up for the bailout in 2021? $5 trillion. Another $5 trillion for the bailout. Shut down the country and all those provisions and everything. $5 billion. And then Biden in 2022 spends another $1.7 trillion in subsidies to big corporations to try to get them to invest. Remember, we called it the Inflation Reduction Act, right? The Infrastructure Act and the Chip and Modernization Act, $1.7 trillion. Okay, so $1.7 trillion, $5 trillion, $1 trillion, that's about $7 trillion in bailouts. And the last element for the budget deficit is really the scamming of federal government health programs by the healthcare industry and insurance companies, big time, starting way back in 2005 when they passed Part D Medicare, which they didn't fund with any tax increase, took it out of the general budget. And ever since, Medicare Advantage, some of you maybe have Medicare Advantage, that's the privatization of Medicare. That's the private camel's nose under the Medicare tent. And they lure people into Medicare Advantage by saying, oh, you get prescription drugs with it, and you get a few other freebies, etc. But they charge you more, and if you're traveling, good luck. It doesn't give you coverage, and then they don't pay everything, and then you got to go to certain doctors. And, they get their money back, and of course the insurance companies cheat like hell on Medicare Advantage. They just cheat the government. So those four things, scamming, Medicaid, SHIP, the kids' health insurance, ACA, ACA, which a nurse once told me when they passed, this is in the Health Care Act, this is a Health Insurance Company Subsidization Act. That's what this is. And she was right. Okay. So all these things, all these healthcare things are taking a big whack out of the annual budget as well. So you put the budget, you put the war spending, you put the tax cutting, you put the bailouts together, and guess what? Whoopee, we got a $38 trillion national debt. $38 trillion today, national debt. Right? Huge. What was it in 2001? 5.7 trillion. We've gone from 5.7 trillion to 38 trillion. Interest payments on the debt back in 2001 were about 300 billion. You know what the interest payments on the debt are today? 1.2 trillion a year. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated at the current rate by 2032, interest payments on the debt is going to be $1.7 trillion. Think about it. 2.3 trillion today for defense, broadly defined, 1.7 trillion for interest on the debt, that's $4 trillion. Hell, there isn't much left, is there? Oh, we better cut some of these social programs. Well, that's exactly what's going on. And it's all because the empire costs too much. They can't afford it anymore. Well, what is the interest payment last year? The share of defense spending, broadly defined, on this 1.5 to 1.8 trillion budget deficit every year. The national debt is just the accumulation of annual budget deficits. Right? We bring in 1.5, 1.8 trillion less than we spend. Well, how do we actually spend that difference, right? We sell treasury securities. The government sells treasury bonds and notes and bills to domestic rich folks and corporations and foreign rich folks, central banks, banks, and corporations. Those are the people who buy treasury. I don't know. Anybody here have a treasury note? Treasury bill, bonds, whatever? Well, maybe in one of your ETFs or something. Huh? Yeah. Well, you're funding the government. Okay. Not too many, right? Okay. So, in other words, the cost is huge of the budget deficits, and now we got this run-up going on in interest payments on the debt. 30% of which are purchases by foreign countries and central banks of our treasuries. By the way, that's becoming a problem. Why? Because it's beginning to look like central banks in countries around the world are reducing their purchases of treasuries. Big time. China's been reducing it for several years now. They used to hold 1.2 trillion. Now they hold about 700 billion. They've dumped about 500 billion. Maybe you've watched the news here recently about Japan. What's going on in Japan in the bond markets in Japan? What's that about? Well, what it's about is they're selling treasuries in order to fund other activities and bonds. It's a complicated situation, but Japan was the second largest holder of U.S. treasuries, 1.1 trillion. After China, of course, it was the largest now, but China only had 700 billion. Oh, well, maybe Japan's going to start buying less treasuries, right? Just as China is buying less treasury, just as a lot of countries around, central banks around the world, are not buying as many treasury bonds. Now that's important, because if you can't sell treasuries, how are you going to finance the $1.8 trillion annual budget deficit? Well, if you can't finance it, then you're going to either have to raise taxes or cut social programs more. So we got this crisis looming here, because the main way of financing the national debt and the deficits, which are caused by tax cutting and more spending, primarily in bailouts. Right? You see the connection there. One leads to the other. How are we going to finance that deficit and that rising interest on it? I mean, the higher the interest rates, which have been relatively high in a couple of years compared to what they were before, raises the amount of national debt and interest payments as well. When the U.S. Treasury has to sell treasury bonds and so forth, it has to pay whoever buys it an interest rate. They call it a yield, right? Well, when your interest rate is high, you've got to pay these foreigners even more. So the costs are going up and up and up, not only for direct defense, indirect defense, but for interest payments, the share. And last year, the share of interest payments, so the 1.1 trillion in interest payments, the share due to the deficits due to defense spending was $268 billion. Now, who gets this money? Well, rich folks and corporations and banks get this money, because they're the ones who buy the treasuries. But the problem increasingly is that they're having trouble selling the treasuries. Well, that means they're going to have to keep interest rates up. But Trump doesn't want them up. He wants them down, because down means you stimulate the economy, right? So there's a contradiction here. How are they going to fund the empire if they keep if they lower interest rates? If they don't lower them, what are you going to do when we have a recession or a slow economy, which we have? So it's a contradiction going on. The empire, the problems are multiplying. Okay, so that's the cost. How do we fund those rising costs that contribute so much to the deficit and annual debt and interest payments on the debt that are getting out of control? How do we fund it? Well, in the 1990s, we funded a defense which was expanding out of economic growth, out of annual GDP. We didn't start this massive tax cutting until George W. Bush, right? So there was revenue. The growth rates were higher. GDP growth rates were higher in the 90s. And we weren't tax cutting as much, so there was more revenue around in order to fund the expansion of the U.S. military. So until George W. Bush comes along, we are funding the expansion of the empire in the 90s out of growth. George Bush comes along and accelerates the cost with his direct wars and all the other costs associated, and I went through the numbers, right? Economic growth is not as robust in the first decade of the 21st century. It's kind of low. When you look at it. We had a recession there, and we had a recession in 2001. But following that, GDP didn't grow very much. It was pretty tepid, right? And then, of course, in 2008-9, we had a crash. GDP does not grow. Revenues do not grow during the crash. Right? So, what did Bush do? Bush turned toward debt financing. Not financing out of economic growth, but financing out of budget deficits and selling treasuries, for example. Now, that's how we shifted. As the costs began to accelerate for wars, we shifted to debt financing. And that's when the national debt and interest payments on the debt really began to balloon after 2001. You know, I said, how much was the national debt in 2001? 5.7 trillion. What was it when Obama left office in 2016? 19.5 trillion national debt. What was it when Biden left office, which includes 4 years of Trump, just continues under Trump? $35.7 trillion. What is it today? 38 trillion. Okay? So the big upsurge begins after 2001 in debt financing because GDP is not growing. It grew only 1% in 2001. It stayed around 2% or so until 2008-9, collapsed 2.6%. Barely grew under Obama. I wrote a book in 2012 on economic book on Obama's first term in office, and it was called Obama's Economy, subtitled Recovery for the Few, which actually happened under Obama. Recovery for the few. We didn't recover the jobs that were lost in 2007-8 until 2015. It took 6 years just to get the job numbers back. In other words, it was a recovery for the banks and for corporations, but it was a very slow recovery for the rest of us. Okay, so debt financing begins, you know, after 2001. But by 2020, 22, debt financing, as I described it, was beginning to hit a wall, wasn't it? Yeah, very difficult. You know, when you got 38 trillion and 1.5, 1.8 trillion annual deficits every year, very difficult to finance. And that's how you should see what Trump is doing today. Trump is looking for alternative sources to fund the accelerating cost of empire. That's how you should understand it. What's the main way he's looking? Tariffs. Tariffs are mostly about revenue generation. How much has he increased revenues? Just 9 months of tariffs, because they didn't start until March. Right? And they've been on again, off again. Right? I mean, a little bit here, a little bit there, The average tariff increase is about 12%. That's not dramatic. That's not 40% or 60%, and he threatens. He's a lot of bombast, and then he pulls back. Like Taco Trump, right? Taco. So, how much revenue has been generated in just the 9 months of 2025 from tariffs? In 2024, before he came in office, we collected $88 billion in tariff revenues. At the end of 2025, we had collected $287 billion. $200 billion annual increase, and he's only just started. What does that mean? That means he is shifting the rising cost of empire to the rest of the world and to the consumers. We're paying for that, and the other countries are paying for that too. The empire's restructuring, we're going to pay for new sources and so forth. Yeah. Now that's not the only thing he's doing. What are some of the other things that he's doing? Well, He's in increasing the tax on remittances, right? If you're sending money, and there's millions of people in this country that send money, mostly back to Central America, Philippines, and India, right? Sending money back. Well, he's increasing the tax. He's closing the loopholes. He's collecting more from remittances. Okay. Military sales. You may not know it, but the U.S. government gets like 4% fee on all U.S. companies selling military arms. 4% fee. And that's why they want to sell more. Not only that, military sales, the more costly they are, the bigger fees the government gets. I expect he'll increase that fee rate. What else? Well, he's talking about H-1B visas, companies that bring middle managers and skilled engineers into the country are going to have to pay $100,000 per person now for H-1B visas. He's talking about gold cards. Remember that? Gold cards, gold card visa. If you're rich and you want a fast track to citizenship, bring your money into the country and pay $5 million to give you a gold card and become a citizen overnight. Now that's another scam, right? Then of course we have the latest thing with Venezuela. It's in process. He's grabbing that oil. He's going to sell that oil. The government's going to sell that oil, and the government's going to keep the proceeds. Now, they'll dribble some of it to Chevron to subsidize it, investing in upgrading and pumping more in Venezuela, and he'll shuffle some of it off to Machado and some of the other opposition government parties in Venezuela to make sure he wins the election, and then he'll just tell the current Maduro government goodbye, right? That's the next phase. Because he's certainly totally tamed that government. By the way, my position is that part of the regime change was not just snatching Maduro. Right? Part of the regime change was buying off a good part of the Venezuelan military and government. I believe that's what happened. That's part of regime change operations today. But that's what happened in Syria. Why did the Syrian army collapse when the HTS rebels just went south from Turkey, right? I mean, they didn't even fight back. Why did they collapse? The generals disappeared. The officers disappeared. So the rank and file just took off their uniforms and went away. There was no resistance. Well, it's been coming out that it looks like the Qatari government paid a lot of the Syrian officer class to stand down. The Qataris are in very tight with the Israelis and the U.S. And I've done some research and it appears that Rodriguez, the acting president in Venezuela, has investments with the Qataris. There's a financial connection there, right? She's not a revolutionary, she's a business person. I don't know, I'm speculating here. I don't know for sure, but it's beginning to smell a little bit. And the operation in Venezuela is beginning to look a lot like the operation in Syria. In other words, the empire is getting much more sophisticated in its regime change operations than it was a decade or so ago. It's getting more serious about it. Well, taking this oil from Venezuela, is part of how you fund the empire. Because as I said, some kind of oil-based sovereign wealth fund will probably be set up by Trump when he gets to 50 million barrels or whatever, then he's going to increase it. He's going to sell that. Who's he going to sell it to? Probably the Europeans, because they don't have enough oil now that the U.S. chase Russia out of Europe. Right? We're already providing them all the natural gas, virtually liquid natural gas, at 4 times the cost that the Russians were selling it to the Germans. This is another reason why the European economy is pretty much stagnant and declining. So what you've got is all these new devices. He's looking for new money and new ways to fund the rising cost of them, and he's finding it. He's finding it. There's a big pot, the biggest pot still sitting unclaimed. What is that pot? That pot is foreign investors and governments taking their dollars and buying U.S. stocks and bonds. Well over $1 trillion a year of reverse flow of dollars come into the U.S. economy, into the stock and bond and derivative markets. So that money is flowing back. By the way, that's why they don't really care about a $1 trillion trade deficit, you see. They turned to a trade deficit ever since Reagan, and they let it run. Because part of the trade deficit is the understanding by these other countries and companies around the world, they're going to recycle those dollars back to the U.S. That's what free trade agreements are really about. You think it's just about goods flowing back and forth? No, it's about financial flows as well. Free trade means U.S. investors and banks can go into Mexico and go into Canada, go wherever they want without any obstacles by their governments. They can invest, buy up the banks, whatever in these countries, right? The U.S. Then fuels other companies that actually produce things offshore, and then they get to send it all back without a tax called a tariff. Have you noticed that Trump has not really messed with the NAFTA, UMCA, whatever they call it now, trade agreement? Because Canada and Mexico are our biggest trade partners. They're the biggest part of the deficit. Free trade is about enabling the offshoring of U.S. capital. That's what it's about. So that those U.S. companies now offshore can send their products without tariffs and tax back to the U.S. That's what free trade is. And it's about financial flows as well. Okay, so the point I was making is this big pot called portfolio FDI, foreign direct investment, trillions of dollars every year coming to the U.S. I predict at some point he's going to have to tax that, charge fees on that flow. Now that's a big obstacle because the U.S. capitalists aren't going to like that. They're going to oppose that. Oh, what? You propose that we reduce sales of our stocks and bonds to the world? That's going to be a hard one. But they're going to reach a point they're either going to have to raise taxes, which they don't want to do, or they're going to have to tax FDI, portfolio FDI to the U.S. My point is that there are lots of pockets of funds out there. And as the empire restructures, what it's doing is finding new ways of financing it. Finding new ways. It's trying to cut costs, in NATO and certain places. By the way, what is this Gaza plan about? Well, the U.S. is going to be in on that. There's money going to flow from real estate. Why do you think Trump's son-in-law, Jared, is in on that? Big time. His company, in cooperation with the Qataris, by the way, have pumped $2 billion into real estate speculation in Gaza. I've always said that the genocide, the war against Gaza, was not about getting Hamas. It was about grabbing the land. That's what it was about. Drive the Palestinians into a corner in the south so it would be totally uninhabitable, and let them die or move, and we'll level the rest of northern Gaza, clear the rubble, and sell it. And that's what it is, a big real estate operation. And Trump's in on that. His family is in on that big time. Okay. So, there's all these ways. The capitalists are very clever in making money and figuring out who to take it from. And that's how you got to understand what's going on now. When I say restructure the empire, I mean the empire as it has existed, under Biden. Unaffordable. Costs outrunning funding. Unaffordable. They got to cut the costs. They got to restructure. To do that, they got to pull out of certain areas. Where are they going to pull out? Europe. They've been financing Europe. Europe's been taking advantage of it. Trump is writing that for decades, right? Okay, Europeans, you want your war in Ukraine, you pay for it. That's what the U.S. is saying. And the U.S. is trying to recruit $350 billion with mineral deals with Ukraine and so forth going on. So the U.S. is going to reduce its $30 billion a year cost for NATO. It's going to reduce that. It's going to pull out of that financing, and cut some of its costs that way. Cut USA, cut that, cut some of these things. Pull out of Europe. Europe is not as strategic to the empire anymore. It's not. What is strategic is the Western Hemisphere and that lake called the Pacific Ocean. That U.S. lake called the Pacific Ocean. That's strategic. And that's why you see Trump, and I predicted that this when he just came into office a year ago. I said he's going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, and the whole agenda is going to be to drive China out. Because China had made certain significant penetrations in the Western Hemisphere. For example, they bought up both of the ports in the Panama Canal and other infrastructure activities. It's their Belt and Road thing. They were rebuilding the ports in Peru and Ecuador and planning a railroad from there into Brazil through the Amazon. They started penetrating Mexico, building the largest electric vehicle plant in the world in Mexico. And of course we know the Chinese electric company BYD is eating Tesla's cake, right? They can't compete against that. So what did Trump do? First thing he came in office, he jumped out of Panama. And he threatened Panama with another invasion, like in 89, And the Panamanians said, well, okay, what do you want? Get rid of the Chinese. So they got rid of the Chinese, and guess who went in and bought up the ports cheap? U.S. private equity companies own those ports now. Yeah. Well, okay, so Panama was immediately cleaned up. Mexico was threatened to cancel its contracts with China, which they did. Ecuador and Peru followed suit. Canada, what's Canada about? Why all the insults to Canada? Well, because the U.S. wanted Canada to help foot the bill to build a new Arctic strategy. Yeah, the Russians are very advanced Arctic strategy. They got like 50 advanced icebreakers and all kind of operations and bases along their northern Arctic coast. The U.S. only has Alaska. And the Canadians didn't want to spend the money on their islands, and then the other piece was Greenland, right? The U.S. for an Arctic strategy needs to cover that whole arc, and that's what Greenland is about. Really, it's about grabbing that land. And by the way, what is this latest agreement? The media is sort of saying, well, he's backed off. No, he hasn't. What is the essence of that framework that the U.S. media is not really reporting very much? Well, it's this. The U.S. can build as many bases it wants in Greenland, and it doesn't have to lease those bases from Denmark or Greenland. It will own that property. That property will be sovereign U.S. territory. Sovereign. The U.S. can go anywhere it wants in Greenland under that framework and develop anything it wants, any mining, any resource grab, whatever it wants. Well, what's the U.S. going to do? It's going to proliferate bases all over the place, call them bases, right? It's going to send in 50,000 troops and people, and guess what? Then you got a population as big as the Greenland population, right? Then you have an election, and then you take the whole thing. That's the whole strategy. Just like the strategy in Venezuela is one bite of the apple now, let's snatch Maduro, let's buy off the government there, and then we'll have elections in the spring, and we'll have a government that's even more under our control. And then we'll just, pump as much oil as we can, and sell it and put it in the U.S. Treasury. So that's the picture of why we've got this restructuring going on. Okay, I think I'm running a little long, so I'm not going to talk about practices. What are the imperial practices? Let me just mention them. Direct invasion, military, limited military action, blockades, ship seizures, fly zones, bombings, right? We see that going on with Trump, right? Regime operations, very aggressive, using special ops and limited military action. These are the practices of empire. So the picture is, it's gotten more aggressive and therefore more successful in terms of practices. The practices were really lagging up until now. But now the U.S. is not relying on CIA electoral change, etc., to grab the government. It's going in and just doing it blatantly. That's what's different today. The institutions are getting weaker. The institutions of empire, we don't have time to go into it, but the U.S. dollar, the IMF, the World Bank, all of these, the G7, the G20, the UN, all of these are not functioning as efficiently as they were before. So a lot of indicators that the institutions of empire aren't performing as efficiently as they used to be. The practices weren't proving successful, so they've changed their strategy and implementing practice changes, which means more force. So both of those are indicators of the empire struggling. It's recovered in some ways. Of course, we don't know what the repercussions are, for Venezuela and Greenland and all that. But there will be repercussions. It's a little early to tell. But it's all part of the restructuring, the reorienting of U.S. imperial practices and shoring up the institutions. But at the bottom of this, and I'll conclude, the bottom of all of this is the financing, the cost and the financing. Because if you look at empires, they always implode internally. And it's usually because they don't have the finances. Just an example, what about the Roman Empire? At its peak in the 2nd century CE, there was 200,000 Roman troops occupying the borders. You know what it was by the 4th century? 500,000. They had increased their military tremendously. They also increased their bureaucracy tremendously. At the same time, they split the empire, so the West had fewer resources. Its army began to decline in numbers and effectiveness. Tribes crossed the border and stole the territories that had the best mines and the best agricultural surplus output, and that's how they paid for their military, and they couldn't do it anymore, so it was the beginning and the end. British Empire, the same thing. The U.S. is approaching the same situation. If you want to understand what's declining, understand the financing and the costs. That explains the military. Eventually, the military starts losing, because it doesn't have the forces. That explains the military and the decline. Okay, so that's basically my analysis in a nutshell. If you read my book, it's much more detailed and all the data and tables are there.
Well, thanks very much, Jack. We've got 15 or 20 minutes for questions and answers. I think this should be very interesting. Krista?
Thank you for your amazing knowledge of that history. What I'm waiting for in your talk is any good news. And how maybe we could learn to sleep at night.
Yeah, well, what's the good news? I don't know. I have a hard time. I don't sleep well at night either. Like you. We're all worried. And we see the domestic repercussions of all this, right, going on. I didn't talk about it, but I have a chapter in a book about how this resort to more force and empire and restructuring and the need for more money results in the decline and an atrophying of democracy. And we see that very dramatically going on a number of dimensions. It really begins in 2001 with Gore versus Bush. The Supreme Court selects George W. Bush, and then all the gerrymandering and all the voter suppression and all the, the political parties and Citizens United, and I mean, there's a whole analysis there as well of why democracy is in decline. And then, we got the latest stuff going on with the president, who's really a tyrant. Tyranny means you don't follow the laws. That's simply what it is. You rule above the law, and that's exactly what he's doing in a whole host of ways. It's tyranny. We no longer, in my opinion, have a constitutional republic in this country. We're pretty much lost the constitutional republic, temporarily, but nonetheless, constitutional republic means the rule of law. And we see that being abrogated everywhere on a whole number of levels. The least of which is, Trump's version of brown shirts called the ICE. That's what that is.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rick. That's a good transition. My question, I just wanted to ask if you could comment a little bit more on how the cost of homeland security and the likes of ICE and anti-immigration, how does that exactly support empire?
Well, that's a good question, but basically, it's an electoral grab. I mean, that was a very popular topic for him to latch onto, to claim that America was in decline and you need someone like me who's going to take dramatic action to do something about it. That was a basic electoral. It doesn't really have that much to do with the financing of empire, right? Or with the rising cost of empire, or with the performance of its institutions. It's really part of this political, democratic tension, I think. And that's how you should read that. Yeah, I mean, they pretty much stopped all of the crossing of the border, but that's all he talks about still, He talks about immigration. Now it's reverse immigration, which means grab people off the street and force them into detention centers and drive them, who knows, away. It's very useful, by the way. The immigration issue is useful insofar as immigration comes from Latin America, because then you claim that countries like Venezuela and others are sending us criminals, right? And that's part of his justification for attacking Latin American countries.
Question, when no one else will buy the bonds, the government can always sell them to the Federal Reserve, which is effectively money printing. How much of a role do you expect that to play going forward?
Well, as you said, and I've been describing, selling bonds, the Federal Reserve on behalf of the U.S. Treasury sells bonds, but it sells bonds to private and governments that buy the bonds. They pay them back. They pay the Federal Reserve in dollars. The dollars are then used to finance, to pay for the deficit spending, which is mostly war spending, right? And the question is, how far can they, what's the future for Treasury bonds and their sales? Increasing their sales, because they got to really increase it, right? It doesn't look very good, because as I said, to increase sales now to domestic buyers, they have to keep interest rates high, but they can't. They've got to lower them when the real economy gets weak. And that's a whole other area of contradiction. One of the themes of my book is, what are the contradictions of empire, right? And the contradictions, I won't get into the details, are monetary policy contradictions, fiscal policy contradictions, and it has to do with the financialization of U.S. capitalism and the offshoring of U.S. capitalism in the 80s and 90s. That has set the stage. The offshoring, globalization they called it, right? The financialization has set the stage for a massive increase in wealth on behalf of the few who manipulate the financial asset markets. That's how they get so rich. And it's also negated the effectiveness of traditional fiscal monetary policy in stabilizing the U.S. economy, both in trying to generate recovery from recession and/or dampen inflation when it occurs. You see, that's really not policy totally. That's the evolution of capitalism is undermining empire in a sense, ultimately. Because the financialization, the globalization, the offshoring has weakened the U.S. economy dramatically. And that's why we just can't get a real growth rate going, and that's why we can't really get rid of inflation. Because these two tools of economics, of macroeconomics, fiscal policy and monetary policy, are not working very efficiently, very well anymore. This is a big factor. That's getting even deeper into the economic sources for the crisis and the decline we're talking about.
What is the scenario that you see of decline morphing into collapse, and who or what fills that void?
Well, as I said, I don't see any imminent collapse like some have been arguing. If you look at the dollar is the economic linchpin of the economic empire, the U.S. dollar, right? The dollar as a reserve currency, in other words, banks and countries using it as their reserve around the world, has not really changed that much. Yeah, it's weakened some, but it hasn't changed that much. The same with the dollar as the transactions mechanism. Now, that's declined a little bit because the world is moving away from using the dollar as the sole currency for purchasing oil and other commodities. That was set up in the 1970s. Right? You got to use dollars. Well, if they're not using dollars to buy and sell oil, which is causing the empire to freak out, by the way, they're going to use other currencies and so forth. That undermines the U.S. global economic hegemony and dominance. But that's just beginning. The BRICS do not have a true alternative currency. They're using their own currencies, right? They're not using the dollar as much. No one wants to get caught holding dollars, because you'll end up like Russia with $300 billion seized, right? You'll never get it back. Venezuela the same. So countries are moving away from dollars, and also as a reserve. That's why you see the price of gold going through the roof. They're buying gold instead of dollars, right? Institutional purchases of gold. Gold is now over $5,000 an ounce. You know what it was a year ago?
It's $5,500 as of an ounce.
Oh, okay, 55. It was $1,900 before Trump came into office. Now it's $5,500. Well, that's an indicator of instability and the fact that the rest of the world is moving away from the U.S. dollar and its international system. By the way, they're moving away from the SWIFT payment system. This is the system the U.S. has used to see who's buying and selling dollars around the world. And it's the SWIFT international system, which works for the banks, by which the U.S. can determine who's violating sanctions. But if countries aren't using SWIFT anymore and they're using China's Enbridge, well then the U.S. can't see who's violating the sanctions and buying Russian oil. That's why they're out there grabbing ships at sea now, right? That's the only solution they can see to deny Russia oil revenues. So the dollar's the linchpin, but if you want to look at it in a materialist way, okay, there are over the horizon, there's some serious problems with it as a reserve currency and a trading currency, right? And the dollar will decline in value. It's already declined 12% in 1 year. But I wouldn't be too upset about that either because, when we had the 2008-9 crash, it declined about 30%. And it recovered. The question is, will it recover? What's going on now is more long-term significance. The dollar decline, the rise of the BRICS, there's 10 BRICS now, but there's 130 countries that are not using the dollar. They're trading mutually in their own currencies or using gold or whatever. Gold will become, once again, the collateral for a new currency, but the new currency is not here yet. new from China. It won't be the yuan. Yuan is something like 3% of all currency. But the momentum's in that direction. Momentum's in that direction. There will be no longer sole dominance by the U.S. currency or those institutions associated with called the IMF and the World Bank.
We've got a question. Chris, we've got. I'm sorry. I'll pass it.
Would you comment on the consumer confidence figures fell this week to a 4-year low, and with that, the dollar falling and inflation rising?
Yeah, well, I've said for quite some time on my show, Alternative Visions, that the U.S. estimate for inflation, whether it's the PCE indicator or the CPI indicator, are lowball. Inflation is much higher. I would say inflation is at least 4 or 5%, and if you're buying certain things, it's double digit. So inflation is much worse, and therefore GDP is much weaker, by the way. Consumer confidence, that's just a reflection of a number of things. Stubborn rising inflation, worries about their jobs. There's a lot of layoffs going on. We don't really know what the inflation and job numbers are for the fourth quarter because for 6 months the government stopped collecting surveys. We don't know. And they said, oh, we're going to plug in some numbers. So I'm very suspect of the job numbers, the inflation numbers, and the GDP numbers for fourth quarter. We're going to have to wait until March or April to see what's happening with the economy. But consumer confidence is kind of volatile. It doesn't really predict the real economy's direction very well. I don't rely on consumer confidence that much, but if you look at it long term, it's weakening. It really means American standard of living has not really improved in 4 years, and people are slowly beginning to feel the pinch and reflecting it.
One last question.
What role is the massive concentration of wealth in the top 1%? And if that were distributed somehow, part of it, could that be part of the solution?
Well, when you talk about wealth, you're talking about financial asset wealth, as well as real incomes. Whether you're talking about wages or revenues or profits or something, that's real income. But financial asset wealth is just price appreciation. Go over with stocks and bonds and derivatives and currencies and all the rest. And that's part of this financialization that I was talking about. Capitalism has shifted towards financial asset wealth, and it's accumulated significantly. When you talk about all the billionaires and all their wealth, the wealth accumulation, it's mostly financial asset accumulation. And that's a problem, because what it means is that the system has turned away significantly from making things that create jobs and incomes and standard of living for people towards making money off of manipulating of financial prices. That's not good for the country, and obviously, it's part of the problem we have. Look, there is a source called the Ulster Database, University of California, the economist Emmanuel Sayers put this together about 25 years ago. And if you look at that database, and I'll finish on this, in the 1990s, all the real economic growth generates real income, right? 48% of all that growth, real growth, went to the 1%. When you get to George Bush, the first decade, same thing, except 65% of all the real economic growth accrued to the 1%. Then you get to Obama, 95% of all the real economic growth, that income reflected from that growth went to the 1%. That's why you got this, exploding inequality going on. Wealth and income inequality, because wealth generates income. And that's a big problem. But it's part of this change in capitalism that's going on.
Jack, may I ask, squeeze one more question in? I'm here over here, Peter Lee. I'd like to, the big elephant in the room is China. I just wondered, how do you see the future relationship with China and the U.S.?
Okay, China is the biggest problem the empire has. Okay? China is advanced economy, advanced technology, and very smart when it comes to geopolitics. And it's the driving force behind the BRICS and the challenge to the dollar and the global hegemony of the U.S. empire, really. Now, Trump tried to take on China with his tariffs, and he quickly backed off because of rare earths and other things. And, you know, he's put that one aside. You know, he's not ready to take that one on. But what is the U.S. doing, and what does it have been doing for the last 4 years? And that is, it is militarily building up its allies in the Pacific. If you look at 2022, I think it was, whether it was Taiwan or Japan or the Philippines or Australia, they were purchasing less than $1 billion a year in U.S. military weapons. You know what they bought last year? $5 to $15 billion each in U.S. military weapons. The U.S. is pumping military weapons, advanced weapons into these countries because it's preparing. It's preparing for a conflict with China. It can't do that while it's still, you know, in the Middle East, while it's still trying to clean up the Western Hemisphere, while it's still trying to deal with the Europeans and Ukraine and Greenland and all that. That's got to be first. The Pacific is on hold. And in the meantime, they're building it up. But I believe the U.S., well, it obviously has plans to take on China, which would be, I think, one of the most foolhardy military adventures ever undertaken by the country. I think that train left the station. I think the best the U.S. could do is eventually in the 2030s let China have their sphere of interest in Asia. The U.S. maintain its sphere in the Americas. You know, Africa is pretty much written off by the empire. And then, of course, we have this big problem with Europe and the crazy Europeans wanting to start another world war. You know, something wrong with those countries, something wrong with the DNA of Europe, I think, you know. There are a bunch of tribes that could never get along, that precipitated 2 world wars, and now if we let them, they'll precipitate another one and ask for the U.S. to come in and fight on their behalf in Ukraine. I hope that never happens. But the U.S. is preoccupied, pretty much. The empire is preoccupied politically, economically, elsewhere, and it knows it cannot take on China at this particular time.
Well, on that note, thanks very much, Jack. And I do encourage people to jackrasmus.com. You can get his information there. A few people were trying to get away before it gets totally dark, but if you've got questions for Jack, please come up and talk to him personally.